Good morning and welcome to U.S.C. My name is Dr. Aaron Tam. I am the U.S.C. Business School Program Coordinator for Tourism, Leisure and Events Management and also now part of the new U.S.C. Molten Bay campus. Today, my discussion and sharing will be about resilient tourism and event businesses. So we've seen a lot in the last few years looking at what the effects of different crises and disasters have had to our landscapes. We've seen in the summer bushfires, leading on to slowly but very quickly and very fast evolving landscapes, the likes of COVID-19 and what it's done to the whole tourism and event landscape. So the question I have for each one of us is, do we have what it takes to be resilient? In this sharing, we will cover the following topics: operating in a V.U.C.A environment, transitioning to new business models, and how to manage crises and disasters. Our first topic is on operating in a V.U.C.A environment. So what does the acronym V.U.C.A mean? V for volatile, U uncertain, C complex, and A ambiguous. So in a nutshell, the environment that we're in is dynamic and evolving very, very quickly. So what does it mean for us as a business? Some questions to ask ourselves are, well, how adaptable are these changes from our operating environment on us, both internally and to the external environment? Some questions to prompt our discussion and reflection. To what extent are we prepared for economic downturns? What's going on in the landscape and managing human resource and finances and cash flows? Some of the social cultural shifts in the experiences sought, from physical, face-to-face, to distant and technology-enabled? What are the environmental crises that we may be confronting more and more likely into the future? Floods, bushfires, cyclones, earthquakes, and many others. So what do we do in this space? Do we consider ourselves industry leaders or followers? And what are our urgent versus important tasks, and which ones of these do we prioritize? This is where we lead on to our second topic on transitioning to new business models. It is about crystal ball gazing, looking into the future, understanding that past and current business models may or may not be as applicable moving to the future. This is where we try and challenge some assumptions, looking at what might have worked and what the future economy will look like, looking at the short-term, middle, and long-term futures. Paying careful attention to the trends and scenarios of what's happening in the landscape. How are people shopping? Where are they traveling to? What are the signs? What does the media portrayal of tourism and events look like? And what does it mean for our region? Some of the available data that's on the market, published by large organizations and industry clients such as Amadeus, talk about the future of tourists. Are they millennials? Are they intergenerational tourists? Do they travel for passion or aspirations? And their engagements with different tourism landscapes tell us some informed stories of how we can position ourselves into the future. And that also then calls on us to be on the front foot. What are the possible ventures or line extensions to our existing products? Do we go laterally and extend our business into camper vans, for example, if you are a car rental organization, or should hotels then own restaurants and delivery services? Some questions for us to think about. We also need to weigh where our resources are. Are they available in-house? Do we outsource? Do we collaborate with others to make ourselves a more viable entity? Those things need to be managed in time and space, and also with the alignment to our organizational priorities. So, what would your customers expect of you as an organization, and where do we see ourselves in this new normal, as many people have called this year? We want to ask ourselves what the blue ocean is, and essentially blue oceans ask to think of where we may be able to redefine and radically challenge the market to make existing competition obsolete. Think Airbnb and Uber. They do not own any assets or fleet by themselves, but yet control a vast proportion of the market space in the accommodation and rideshare business. What are the partners or agencies to leverage on mutual capabilities? Could it be a film company? Could it be someone who's delivering food to your potential clients? Would it be somebody doing virtual reality? These are some important questions to take us into this new future. What are the perspectives and arguments for new value creation or co-creation? How do our customers work with us where customers tell us what they don't need and what we therefore should eliminate? How do we then streamline certain levels of bureaucracy to enable more efficient ways to think about operations? How would we actually increase personalization? Perhaps it might be through social media, websites that can customize preferences and wants, storing of big data to allow us to tell new patterns about how people engage, where they go on the weekends or the days off. And how do we then create niche experiences? Could it be through storytelling? Could it be through gamification? And this then provides an extra incentive for tourists and visitors to actually visit our destination over and over again. So this really calls for us as a resilient business to think outside the box. We need to think of ways to co-brand, how we can actually become a stronger market entity, whether it be through retail, accommodation, restaurant, catering, entertainment services, partnership with sister cities and regions, potentially here on the Molten Bay, it might be to Winton or some of our partners in the Japan or Asia region. Thinking of circular green economies, this is a new emerging area with the large number of unemployment and people facing challenges related to job certainty. This might be a way for tourism and events businesses to work with those with the skill sets to offer some form of complementary creation of value to enable them to both leverage out of their skills and abilities. And also the diversification of experiences. How about a mini Woodford? Separating the whole entire event into different pockets to enable people to have a similar experience in their own backyard perhaps, in a smaller community hall where it's still safe to do so. A recent example here is the use of V.U.C.A, where they've allowed strawberry sundaes and Deadwood dogs at pop-up stores. And that could be one way to actually continue to keep the spirit of some of these community and large-scale events up and running. So this also leads on to our third discussion of how we manage crisis and disasters. There are several stages to look at when we look at crisis and disaster management. The first important stage is what do we do with our training and induction of our workforce to deal with this? And this is even before the crisis or disaster has hit a destination or region. Are there manuals in place? Do people know what should be done when they are at risk of simulating, for example, an earthquake, a flood, a cyclone, or a terrorist attack? These things should be prepared just as we would prepare for fire evacuation, for example. What about an emergency contingency plan? Have we got plans in place to take our staff, resources, assets, and enable them to be stored in safe places as well as for our visitors? Are we able to communicate with our tourists and visitors who may not necessarily speak English as a first language? And that's where the potential for apps and online resources into different languages would be quite useful. We look at what has been done in COVID-19 where places like Melbourne have had to translate many of the resources and materials to different languages because we know we are now operating in very cultural and linguistically diverse communities. We also need to work very closely with our local authorities. Who's going to be the front and communicating a strategic and a coherent body of information around the notion of crisis management? Where does this data come from? Is it Queensland Health, Queensland Transport, the local police force, and so on? So essentially, we've got the three stages of crisis management. Pre-crisis, before when it hits. In crisis, when the crisis is ongoing, and therefore we need to then think of ways to actually manage its spread and its impact. And post-crisis, where the event has finished, tourists may have gone back to their home country, to a safe region, but we want to still be able to engage all our stakeholders to eventually bring them back when it is safe to do so. So this is where our communication channels need to be clear and coherent. We need to continue to think of who else might be in this landscape. Could it be the airlines? Could it be the hotels? Could it be the restaurants? And this is where some of the upcoming case studies will show us a little bit about how communication has been done both verbally, print, and digitally as well, that we have our traction and understanding who are some of these influencers and how can they be word-of-mouth marketing for us into the future. Then we also need to do some post-crisis debriefs, understanding what has happened and take action steps to enhance some of our crisis management footprints into the future. Finally, the area of post-crisis marketing and PR come in, and this is where brands become stronger, learning from the past. We know that crises and disasters are inevitable parts of the tourism and events landscape, but certainly we can come back stronger and understanding how this could be one way to actually drive our business, because there are signs that the tourist industry and the events industry have been resilient over a long time, and the tourists will likely come back because they value some of the magical experiences they have had in a geographic region. So how do we work closer with our stakeholders? Here are some examples and tips of where we might be able to find some relevant resources. The government websites, the Department of Tourism, Small Business and the Commonwealth Games does have some information on where we can actually find useful stakeholders to work with, both within our field of expertise and outside. Some of the industry advocacy groups such as V.U.C.A and climate change mitigation, so how do we manage this for extreme heat in summer and the changing patterns of winter, for example. We also look at forums that have disseminated a whole range of COVID-19 and bushfire types of information, such as PATA. And we also can see and leverage on the back of some successful partnerships of Holiday Home this year, for example, looking at Tourism Australia campaigns. Some of the local, state and regional COVID plans might be useful as well, because these might be changing on a day-to-day basis. How many people you might have in your own organization, both during the weekdays and weekends, certain number of hours perhaps, and also where the different case studies are on the COVID safe plans to enable us to flourish in this very new and very pressing landscape. Here are some of the resilience characteristics. One, to be able to accept change, understanding that these things are going to be inevitable, but also for us to think of ways that we can actually become stronger and learn from some of the best practices or good practices in the field. The agility and speed of response, how we might be able to demonstrate this based on where we see our next possible trend might be, or how we can actually pivot ourselves to areas where there are going to be key markets and still enable our business to flourish. What are the opportunities and yet also within some of the imminent challenges? Could we actually have some recorded or 3D images of some of our experiences to take people on to our digital platforms? This is where a lot of the home-based entertainment is also growing. Potentially some of our Netflix or Disney Plus channels perhaps could be new ways for us to engage with our tourism and events businesses. We must accept that no action is probably not the best consideration and action of all. This is not a time to take inaction, because clearly as an industry, we recognize that 70 to 80% of our businesses are small to medium enterprises that require the flow of visitor numbers to keep us afloat. And this is where we want to be able to think, how best can we pivot, change, modify our operations to enable us to be in this landscape where yes, consumption still occurs, but how do we use our assets in a more strategic way? Understanding also how we might be able to showcase best or good practices. Our policies are there, sometimes they may not necessarily be clear, but this is our way to perhaps inform and guide others who may be following in this space. Perhaps a digital heritage trail could be one new landscape. Perhaps it may be working with schools and centers to create some backyard stories as well. And obviously the key one here, taking key steps to mitigate future risks. No one knows when the vaccine for COVID will be or when the next bushfire season will look like, and therefore we want to be able to think of ways to kind of future-proof our businesses. Finally, on this note, to also lead and empower staff, understanding that people in line managers or authority levels may or may not be the persons to actually lead in a time of crisis. So trust your staff, empower them, and allow them to stand up during these times of adversity. These are the times when people show true courage and leadership, and it is also when we've witnessed that some of them take key decisions, understanding that they are the coalface of working with consumers. One of the case studies that I would like to highlight is the notion of Molten Beethoven. It was a simple campaign, but it was powerful in its messaging. of the different stakeholders that come together, this was a story to say that yes, industry is suffering and challenged by some of the landscape so far, but certainly we are able to hang out and become stronger and leverage on one another. Through its powerful platforms, social media, YouTube channels, and many others, these are ways to also showcase a destination and tell people that yes, we're still here and we're still here when the going gets tough. So this is one area where I encourage you to look at these resources as a way to showcase a business. A second case study in point is the use of where your current assets might be new, simple ways of innovation in areas where I would call a low-hanging fruit. The picture that you see on the screen is on the Molten distilleries and how they've actually been able to use their supplies of alcohol to turn that into hand sanitizers to feed a given need in these current times. Many other distilleries have done a similar process and approach the Queensland Health to say, well, we've got all these supplies of alcohol that are hospital grade, can we turn that into health resources to support a key market? And certainly this has been an area which has been of short supply across the country, at least for the last couple of months, and now we are able to do so. So what are some of these learning practices from some of these organizations? One, to assess your market of some of the possible adaptations. Leverage on your strengths, what you have, not looking at what you don't have. What are the available resources within your organization? If it's a fleet of boats, could they not be used into some of these remote sensing areas where you might need to render help to regional and more challenging to access communities? Can you get approval to modify some of your brand extensions, such as in the case of a distillery, to produce hand sanitizers? Can you provide, through your supply chain, the ability to have viable quantities to actually meet your communities with the market demands? For instance, at the university, we've turned 3D printers to provide for some protective professional equipment to be able to send that to our different stakeholders. What are the different alternative forms of revenue generation that you could create downstream? Perhaps it might be, as in many restaurants, how you change and work with your rideshare companies to actually deliver food to different organizations. Airbnb, for example, would have leveraged on their excess assets and turned that into places where, with government approval, places for quarantine when the need requires of it. What this does, it also generates some top of mind brand outcomes. An organization that's able to actually work during a crisis becomes right in the center of attention, and it does bring people's attention to say, you know what, this business is not just key upon its bottom line of profit, it also cares for its community, and therefore we will continue to support it. What this then does is to leverage on the media outcomes and create some word of mouth publicity. The word will spread, and this viral effect of marketing will then stand the organization in good stead come the future. Another area where we want to think of is also how we may create long-term future legacies for our communities, our regions, and beyond. The example here is to look at also the investments during times of crisis where you can make real key strategic and coherent roles in the area of sport, women, and looking at long-term sporting legacies. The recent announcement where Brisbane Roar will create a women's soccer academy here in the Moreton Bay region offers us some unique landscapes as well, how we might be able to be resilient into the long term. Some of the contemporary topics and opportunities. We are without doubt one of the front runners to look at hosting some of the key events on the recent announcement of Australia and New Zealand winning the bid to host the FIFA World Cup Women 2023 edition here on our shores. So therefore, here are some areas to make some strategic areas of investment to guide and to be innovative in an event that's only 3 years away from today. We want to also partner some key agenda to the state and bring in infrastructure and investment from other parts of the country. Agendas such as women in sport, diversity, inclusion, and this would be a huge conversation to be able to bring other stakeholders to the landscape and think of ways to actually create opportunities in a time of crisis as such. Some of the other things to think of in terms of infrastructural investments could be coming from complementary groups. Things like transport, infrastructure like hospitals, libraries, high-performing sporting training facilities, for example, could become part of the key agenda moving forward, and this could then attract international markets and players, consortiums, who also may be keen to leverage on some of these growing areas of sport, which is a landscape in many cultural identities around the world. What this also does, it induces public and private partnerships. This allows us to actually think in terms of ways that we can actually get governments, industry, residents, and stakeholders to build their future together. Because the event doesn't stop in 2023, for example. It continues to build on to legacies through educational institutions, sporting hubs and communities who can all be part of this in becoming a fitter and stronger Queensland. Finally, what it does, it also grows regional awareness and interest to a place like Molten, and this is also where we can leverage on our coastal areas like Bribie and many other parts of the coast, right through to the hinterlands, and offer a wider range of sport outside of soccer. Might be things like BMX trails, might be things like rugby, might be things like drone flying, for example. And these are landscapes that we can actually think of that allow us to leverage on some of the assets that we've got to grow into a more viable, sustainable future. So in summary, what we've done is to look at ways to quantify what we are looking at in terms of a crisis or disaster environment, how we might be able to manage some of these landscapes as they unfold, and looking at some of the good or best practices that exist in this current landscape. This is about, for us, not so much in the area of being prescriptive, but also a very iterative and contextual-based landscape. Do what you need to do with the resources that you have and continue to be supported as a collegial environment where people are working in the tourism and events community that is fairly much together in one coherent whole. Finally, on that note, also look at where you may be able to take some time to reflect and assess, evaluate yourselves in terms of some of these resilient indexes that are available for you to undertake at your own time. Thank you, and I look forward to work with many of you in the area of tourism and events resilience. My name is Aaron again, and thank you for your time, and welcome to the Sunshine Coast and the Molten Bay campus. See you.